Hello and welcome to The Drug Trip. This channel is here to feed the curiosity of those who would like to gain an insight to the effects of various drugs and substances through user experiences and stories, with our main goal being to entertain and reduce harm and abuse. We post regular trip reports every few days, so if you do enjoy these, we would really appreciate it if you subscribed. And more importantly, we love to hear our viewers' thoughts, opinions and experiences, so please leave something for us in the comment section and we may use it in a future video. Enjoy and be safe. This was only my second experience with psychedelics. The first was a mild trip on one hit of acid, and my friend Kay, who had tripped several times on mushrooms but was just as new to LSD as I was, warned me that we really hadn't been tripping. He said, "You can sense when you've crossed that threshold. It feels somehow sharp. You know you're in it for the long haul." This really didn't bother me. My last experience had been so universally positive that it was hard to me for it to imagine what a difficult trip would be like. Ignorance is bliss, eh? I couldn't have asked for a better day to trip. It was well into autumn, and all the leaves were all shades of brown, red, golden, some on the ground, some still clinging onto the trees. The day before had been quite cold, which had me worried I'd have to trip indoors, but on the day it was unusually warm, almost like summer, but with a crisp fall breeze. The sun lit the landscape so intensely that it reminded me of my last trip. My friend T attributes days like this to one of the stoner god, a benevolent deity who blesses hippies and heads with nice days to trip on. After eating breakfast with the 4 friends that I would be tripping with, smoked a bowl, and preparing our trip kits, we set off towards the park. Almost halfway there, around 11:30, we stopped at a bench to take our hits. I never ceased to be amazed that so powerful a drug comes in such an unassuming package, and I mused to myself about this as I held the tiny piece of blotter paper under my tongue. My friend P knew several people who had tripped off the same sheet, and the word was that it was excellent acid. He described the feeling you get waiting for the acid to kick in as like preparing to go on stage. I recalled the nervous excitement and mental preparation from when I did theatre in high school. Everyone was in such high spirits from the weather, though, that I hardly thought about the acid that was still in my mouth. As we entered the park and headed up the trail to Lookout Point, which was our first destination, I started to notice the colours more deeply. I saw my friends slowing down and looking more intently at the trees, and assumed that the sensation had hit them at almost the same time. P smiled and said, "Do things look really bright to you?" I nodded with a grin, and he added, "I think I might be tripping." As we sat down on the giant rocks, I suddenly felt a tightness in the back of my neck and a buzzing sensation in my head. I just closed my eyes and leaned back against the rock, trying to calm myself, but my mind was chattering with odd, disjointed thoughts, and the tension had increased so that I kept trying to yawn. I realised that I felt cold, and I stumbled to my sweatshirt and jacket, which I had discarded a few feet away. When I pulled them onto my body, I felt a tingle down my spine, and the fabric was pleasantly warm but oddly harsh on my skin. By the time I made it back to the rocks, the hallucinations had begun. With my eyes closed, I saw a magnificent spiralling fractal pattern radiating red and yellow shapes from a point that I sensed could only be the depths of my subconscious. Incidentally, at a later date, I told a friend that my spirals always went counterclockwise, and he said his are always clockwise. We speculated that this may have something to do with the left and right side of the brain, but I digress. When I opened my eyes, I saw the textures on the leaves and rocks seemingly smoulder. They would ripple and darken, then peel away and send what looked like traces into the air. Seeing me struggle, P asked, "How are you doing?" The last thing I remember saying for some time was, everything is melting. At this point, I experienced what would later learn to be ego death. But the feeling was alien and unpleasant as I desperately tried to cling on to my sense of self-being while the drug acted to deconstruct it. My mind felt fractured, as if I was existing in several places and times simultaneously. Cause and effect had lost all meaning, so I began to have disjointed memories with no sequential relationship to one another. This led me to believe momentarily that time itself was just an illusion, and that each moment in my life was occurring at the same time. Questions such as, who am I? And what is fundamental? These questions led to the radical deconstructions of existence, because everything I thought could be abstracted one step further. I found myself flailing to find a sort of cognitive ground, some sort of fundamental thought upon which I could base my experience. Time, space, personality, and causation had all failed. And at this point, they were lacking any sort of reference. My consciousness was a whirlwind of thoughts without context. At some point, my other friend, Kay, he looked at me and asked, "How are you?" I looked at him slowly and nodded my head. Words could not express how I was, so it seemed sufficient enough to give him the affirmative yes. I exist. How I am is not an issue. I just am. I also recall an odd moment of clarity in which I stressed to myself, this is only a drug. Even if it's difficult, you'll still come down eventually. In retrospect, I am almost proud of myself for having such strength to think such a thing in the midst of such a shitstorm. After we had been sitting at Lookout Point for some time, in various mental conditions, my other friend A, who was very familiar with LSD and more adept than the rest of us, he insisted that we continue hiking and make our way to the lake. My other two friends agreed, but I looked to one friend to find that he seemed to be struggling just as much as I was, if not more. I tried to protest, but had difficulty speaking clearly. A insisted that moving would help calm me down, and the group began moving. They couldn't have been more correct, because as soon as I had a goal, something to draw my attention away from the madness in my own head, I began to realise that my surroundings were absolutely gorgeous. The ground was covered in a carpet of golden leaves that made the atmosphere seem to glow with an aura of the same colour. The tree branches turned into spiralling tendrils of light that would curl themselves into circles before spinning off into the air, as if propelled by their own inner energy. The bark was bulging and rippling with dark, craggy patterns. All of the trees looked like the ancient, massive trees you see in pictures of the primeval forests in Europe, except that the bark was crawling about and rearranging itself. We stopped again to rest, and immediately I was back in the confusion of my own mind, stronger, but not yet in control. P said, "We need some music, why don't you play your harmonica?" I remembered that I had my harmonica in my pocket, and I put it to my lips, hoping that I would remember how to play it. I found myself unable to play coherent melodies, but I discovered that it was intensely pleasing and calming to me to simply inhale and exhale through it, producing the two fundamental chords. On a harmonica, inhaling produces the V chord, and exhaling produces the I chord. V to I is the most basic cadence in all of music, tension and resolution. Some musicologists have theorised that moving from I to V represents leaving home, while the V to I resolution represents the return to home. I was not actively conscious of this theory at the time, but I simply knew that this was the case. Inhale, exhale, VI, tension release, away, home. This duly implicit in the harmonica was like a revelation. Suddenly I knew the cognitive ground that I could use to understand my shattered reality. Everything exists in two states, dissolution and resolution, away and home. This simple phrase became a mantra for me. At once, the madness of my experience collected itself into archetypal manifestations of this fundamental truth. I began to babble to my friend about the discoveries, the duality of all things, the cyclical progression from dissolution to resolution and back again, the psychological meaning of home. I was obsessed with the notion of home. I insisted that all of life is just finding home in the present moment, discovering the resolution of all tensions, psychologically returning to the first state of oneness before moving back into the chaos and repeating the process. At some point during this time, I had the bizarre sensation that P and I were shooting thoughts back and forth between our minds, non-verbally. But these thoughts consisted only of sounds. I really can't explain this, but that's what it felt like. After walking for a long time, we arrived at the lake. The size and brilliance of it completely overwhelmed me. As we wound around the shoreline, I admired the plants around me, which had taken on a painterly quality instead of continuous lines. They looked like bold strokes of colour moving independent of one another. Finally, we found a shady spot near the water's edge and sat to eat. At that moment, I felt completely at one with the universe and my companions. I reached the conclusion that all of life is really a manifestation of the same universal life form, realising that this life would continue forever without me. I had no fear of death, though I felt fortunate enough to have been given a portion of this life to do with as I please. As I sat in perfect bliss, marvelling at the implications of my insights, I realised that I was home.